cross the personal line, he's not going to have my respect. He's not going to have my team's respect. All I'm going to need is 2 minutes in the octagon with you. Then I'm going to put you to sleep in front of your whole family, your country, in front of everyone. My name is Ilia Topuria. I'm a professional athlete. But I'm the best.
Nobody saw this coming. Not because the signs weren't there, but because nobody believed they could apply to him. Ilia Topuria has officially walked away from the UFC. Not after years of punishment. Not after injuries piled up. Not after long decline. He retired immediately after suffering the first defeat of his entire career. And the circumstances surrounding that loss, the setting, the opponent standing across from him, and what unfolded afterward feel almost unreal. Like something pulled straight from a movie script. Just 18 months earlier, Topuria looked invincible, undefeated, untouchable, holding championship gold, and carrying an aura few fighters ever achieve. He had already beaten Alexander Volkanovski, then moved up in weight and brutally stopped Max Holloway, cementing himself as more than just another champion. Analysts, insiders, and fans were already placing him in conversations reserved for all-time greats. By fight week, his confidence had reached another level. He had a coffin built for his opponent. A single white rose rested on top. Cameras captured him confronting Justin Gaethje at the final press conference, then shoving him on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as millions watched. Topuria insisted the ending had already been written. Then, under the lights, in front of Donald Trump and a global audience, everything changed. He was knocked out. 3 days later, at only 28 years old, he was gone from the sport. This is the complete story of how MMA's most fearless star may have unknowingly scripted his own downfall, and what he revealed once it was finally over.
And I think that was the choice he had to make because it was going to continue to get worse. I beat his ass in the first round. Like, it might have been close on the scorecards. I absolutely took the first round, but the amount of damage that I inflicted in the first round set up the rest of the fight.
To understand how everything unraveled, you first have to understand what UFC 317 was supposed to represent. This was never marketed as an ordinary title fight. This was never just another pay-per-view main event. The UFC deliberately placed this championship clash on one of the biggest stages imaginable, a venue loaded with symbolism, history, and political significance. With a sitting U.S. president in attendance and millions watching across the globe, the pressure surrounding this event was unlike anything Topuria had experienced before. He entered that night with a flawless 17-0 record. But it wasn't just the undefeated streak that made him so feared. He had already stopped Alexander Volkanovski, widely regarded as one of the greatest featherweights ever, twice in succession. Then he moved divisions, dismantled Max Holloway, captured lightweight gold, and returned still carrying the aura of a double champion. By that point, analysts weren't struggling to explain how good he was. They were struggling to find language big enough to describe it. Justin Gaethje stood opposite him as the mandatory challenger. A former interim lightweight champion. A veteran who had survived wars with names like Khabib Nurmagomedov, Tony Ferguson, Charles Oliveira, and Dustin Poirier. A man who had delivered violence at the highest level for years. Yet despite all of that experience, very few people believed he could win. The betting lines reflected it. The media narrative reflected it. Even casual fans had already skipped ahead to the ending. The only debate seemed to be how quickly Topuria would finish him, not whether he would. And that's where this story truly begins. Because the hostility between Topuria and Gaethje wasn't manufactured for headlines. It wasn't scripted by promoters or designed by a marketing team. According to people around both camps, the tension was genuine, and every public appearance only made things worse. The first warning signs surfaced during the initial kickoff press conference weeks before fight night. The two men immediately clashed. Verbal shots were exchanged, and the atmosphere turned tense almost instantly. But Gaethje crossed into deeply personal territory when he publicly dismissed Topuria as nothing more than a gimmick, not a real champion, not a legitimate fighter, but a carefully crafted image designed for cameras. Then he went even further. Without prompting, Gaethje referenced Topuria's divorce in front of reporters and cameras, saying, "I understand why anybody would leave him." That single comment changed everything. The rivalry stopped feeling promotional and started feeling personal. Topuria's response didn't come through words. It came through imagery. Chilling imagery. He unveiled a coffin bearing Gaethje's likeness, placing a single white rose on top as cameras rolled. It looked less like pre-fight promotion and more like a public funeral. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't being presented as a contest. It was being presented as an execution, and Topuria intended to deliver it. The tension finally exploded during the final pre-fight press conference on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The location alone suggested everyone involved wanted this event to feel historic. What nobody anticipated was the chaos that followed. During the face-off, Topuria suddenly shoved Gaethje. Not a light push. A forceful shove that instantly changed the mood. Dana White's reaction, caught live on camera, revealed immediate frustration. The UFC had invested heavily in staging a massive promotional event at one of America's most recognizable landmarks, and now its champion was physically confronting his opponent in front of the entire world. Gaethje didn't retaliate physically, but he made sure everyone heard his response. Gesturing toward the Lincoln Memorial and the National Mall behind them, he said, "Look at this beautiful view, and you want to act like an animal." He then labeled Topuria an emotional little animal. Topuria later defended his actions, claiming he had warned Gaethje repeatedly not to step closer and that Gaethje had essentially challenged him to throw a punch. According to Topuria, he made a calculated decision in that moment. A punch could have triggered commission involvement and jeopardized the fight. A shove wouldn't, so he shoved. Whether that was discipline or deliberate provocation depends entirely on whose side you're on. And as if the spectacle wasn't already spiraling, heavyweight Josh Hokett, who wasn't even competing in the same division, decided to join the pile-on. Sharing the stage, Hokett mocked Topuria's height, joking that he was so short he couldn't even see himself in a bathroom mirror. By then, the insults were coming from every direction. The fight hadn't even started, and the atmosphere already felt combustible.
He's so short he can't see himself in the bathroom mirror, and he married a stripper from Miami. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The incredible Hulk.
The fans ate it up. Every insult, every confrontation, every headline. But Ilia Topuria wasn't laughing. By the time fight night finally arrived, Topuria had spent weeks convincing the world that Justin Gaethje's fate had already been sealed. He built a coffin. He placed flowers on it. He shoved his rival on the steps of a national monument. He absorbed every personal shot, every accusation, every joke about his size, and transformed all of it into something dangerous. Absolute certainty. As far as Topuria was concerned, Saturday night wasn't a fight. It was the final chapter. And he had never sounded more convinced in his entire career. The opening round, however, created a false sense of security. Topuria looked sharp from the opening bell. Calm, loose, in control. He established distance early, moved fluidly, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a champion who believed the ending had already been written. Gaethje, meanwhile, stayed patient. He probed. He feinted. He refused to rush. The early exchanges revealed exactly how Topuria wanted this fight to unfold. Measured pressure, precise counters, calculated violence. It was the same formula that had dismantled elite opponents before. And for long stretches it worked. Topuria landed clean. He looked explosive. He looked dangerous. He looked exactly like the unstoppable champion everyone expected to see. Then, everything changed. Halfway through the second round, Gaethje landed a right hand that snapped Topuria's head backward. It wasn't a knockdown. It wasn't even the hardest punch of the fight. But it mattered. Because for the first time all night, Topuria looked affected. And more importantly, Gaethje saw it. In that instant, he realized something the rest of the arena hadn't fully recognized yet. Topuria could be touched. More than that, he could be hurt. For a fighter like Gaethje, information like that is priceless. He built his entire career on surviving chaos, absorbing punishment, and eventually finding the opening that changes everything. Once he sensed vulnerability, he never stopped searching for it again. The damage began accumulating almost invisibly. Topuria continued landing. But so did Gaethje. The difference was that Topuria had grown accustomed to watching opponents break beneath his pressure. Gaethje wasn't breaking. He wasn't retreating. He was studying. He was waiting. And late in the second round, he finally found what he had been looking for. Topuria loaded up on a combination, the same aggressive sequence that had ended so many fights before. But this time, Gaethje saw it coming. He stepped in. A straight right hand exploded directly down the middle. It landed perfectly. Topuria crashed to the canvas. There was no stumble. No desperate attempt to regain balance. No dramatic scramble back to his feet. He was down. Seconds later, the referee waved it off. Just like that, it was over. No recovery. No miracle escape. Ilia Topuria, the undefeated 17-0 double champion, the man many believed was destined for all-time greatness, lay unconscious on the canvas in front of a sitting U.S. president and thousands of fans who had arrived expecting a coronation. Instead, they witnessed a collapse. Justin Gaethje had just shattered one of the most dominant streaks the UFC had seen in years. But the real shock was still coming. Because losing a fight is one thing. Fighters lose. Champions rebuild. The sport moves on. What happened next felt different. 3 days later, Topuria finally broke his silence. He didn't issue a carefully prepared statement through management. He didn't hold a press conference. He went directly to his audience. Directly to the people who had followed every step of his rise. And he spoke with startling honesty. I came into this sport to prove something. I've proved it, and I'm not willing to give this sport the version of me that chases ghosts. Read that again. He wasn't demanding an immediate rematch. He wasn't promising revenge. He wasn't talking about redemption. At just 28 years old, following the first loss of his professional career, on the biggest stage imaginable, Topuria announced that he was retiring from the UFC. The entire MMA world froze. Because this isn't how combat sports stories are supposed to end. The accepted script is familiar. The undefeated champion falls, disappears for a while, rebuilds himself, and eventually returns stronger. Fans expect it. Promoters count on it. Fighters themselves usually can't resist it. Topuria rejected all of it. And perhaps the most striking part of his announcement wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. He never blamed Gaethje. He never demanded another fight. He never claimed controversy. He never searched for excuses. Instead, he simply stated that the version of himself that needed fighting was the version that needed proving. And according to him, that version no longer exists. Maybe that's the most self-aware statement ever delivered by a fighter immediately after suffering a knockout defeat. Or maybe it was written in the emotional aftermath of the most devastating night of his career. Truthfully, it may be both. Probably both. The reactions arrived almost instantly. From fighters, analysts, former champions. And when Gaethje was asked about Topuria's retirement announcement, his response was exactly what many expected. Direct, blunt, and impossible to ignore. Gaethje's response was short, but it carried weight. If that's what he wants, I respect it, he said. But I think he'll feel differently once the adrenaline fades and that belt starts calling his name again. That single statement may explain this entire rivalry better than anything that happened inside the cage. Because even after scoring the biggest win of his career, Gaethje didn't sound like a man closing a chapter. He sounded like someone expecting another one. Watching, waiting, preparing. And then there was the silence. Topuria's camp, which had been incredibly vocal throughout fight week, suddenly disappeared from the conversation. In the build-up, they had projected absolute certainty. Interviews, predictions, headlines. There was always another message, another declaration, another reminder that they believed the outcome was inevitable. Then, after the retirement announcement, almost nothing. And in combat sports, silence can be louder than any press conference. To fully understand why this loss shocked so many people, you have to look at what Topuria had accomplished before that night. He had finished every single opponent he faced inside the UFC. Every one. 14 fights. 14 finishes. No decisions. No narrow escapes. No surviving until the final bell. In divisions as deep and unforgiving as featherweight and lightweight, numbers like that are almost unheard of. Across the history of the sport, finishing rates like Topuria's barely exist. Regardless of what happens next, those achievements are already permanent. They belong to history. But none of those victories prepared him for what Justin Gaethje brought into that cage. Because what fans witnessed at UFC 317 wasn't simply an upset. It wasn't a fluke. And it wasn't just a great champion having an off night. What unfolded was combat sport's oldest lesson, disguised as something entirely new. The easy explanation is obvious. Topuria became overconfident. He embraced the villain role too completely. The coffin, the rose, the shove at the Lincoln Memorial, the personal insults, the constant escalation. Many observers believe he became emotionally invested in proving a point rather than simply winning a fight. But insiders suggest something deeper may have been happening. Gaethje wasn't just preparing physically for months. He was studying, watching, collecting information. He understood Topuria's combinations. He recognized his tendencies. He knew when Topuria committed fully to offense and when emotion began overriding discipline. And every public confrontation provided another clue. Every insult, every reaction, every heated exchange. Each one revealed just how personally Topuria had started taking this rivalry. In fighting, that matters. Because emotionally invested fighters sometimes abandon the game plan in moments that last less than a second. They chase finishes too early. They force exchanges that aren't there. They confuse pressure with control. And occasionally, they fight their emotions instead of their opponent. Meanwhile, the man almost everyone dismissed entered the cage with something few people noticed. Clarity. The same fighter Topuria had symbolically buried weeks earlier arrived focused, patient, and emotionally detached. Cold. Calculated. Ready. That white rose resting on the coffin may ultimately reveal more about Topuria's state of mind than it ever did about Gaethje's chances. And if Gaethje recognized that, which many believe he did, he used it perfectly. That's not luck. That's one of the most overlooked weapons in combat sports, convincing your opponent to perform for the moment instead of competing within it. Which brings us to the question nobody can answer. What happens now? If Topuria's retirement stands, it immediately becomes one of the most shocking departures in UFC history. A 28-year-old two-division champion walking away after the first defeat of his career. No demands for a rematch. No public unraveling. No promises of returning stronger. Just an exit. If he truly means it, he joins an incredibly small group of fighters who left the sport before the sport had the chance to take everything from them. It's a path almost every fighter dreams about. Very few ever manage to follow it. But there is another possibility. And history suggests it may be the more likely one. Fighters announce retirement after devastating losses all the time. The emotions are genuine. The pain is real. The desire to walk away feels absolute. And then the weeks pass. Months pass. The injuries heal. The noise fades. And eventually, the call of competition starts getting louder again. For many fighters, that's when the real battle begins. Time passes. The bruises fade. The body recovers. But fighters rarely battle only with injuries. Eventually, the emotions settle. Pride begins to rebuild. The shock loses some of its sting. And sooner or later, the phone starts ringing with opportunities, with offers, with numbers large enough to make unfinished business feel less like desperation and more like fate. Right now, Justin Gaethje holds the championship. The very belt Topuria built his legacy around. The same belt he expected to defend under the brightest lights imaginable, with a sitting president in attendance and the world watching what was supposed to be another historic triumph. But there is another element to the story one almost nobody is talking about. And it may be the most important factor of all. Ilia Topuria has never experienced this before. He has never had to rebuild. He has never had to answer questions after defeat. Every significant setback in his career happened long before championship gold, long before global fame, and long before millions of people were analyzing every second of his life in real time. For years, Topuria's image was built on one idea: invincibility. He wasn't simply winning. He was overwhelming, dominating, erasing opponents. Which means neither Topuria, nor perhaps even those closest to him, truly knows what version of Ilia Topuria exists on the other side of a knockout loss. And that's where the story becomes fascinating, because the coffin he built for Gaethje, the white rose he carefully placed on top, the symbolic ending he spent weeks promoting, many observers now believe it may have represented something entirely different. Not the end of Gaethje, but the end of Topuria's undefeated identity. Because from this point forward, his journey changes completely. The road ahead may prove longer than he expected, harder than he imagined, and far more uncertain than anything he envisioned during fight week. Yet if history has shown anything about Topuria, it's this. He has spent his entire career proving people wrong. Again and again. He has thrived when doubted, when dismissed, when counted out. He has always chosen the difficult path, the defiant path, the path that forces the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew. So whether this truly is retirement, or merely the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one thing seems certain. Ilia Topuria will not willingly accept a story that ends without his approval. The only mystery still hanging over the sport is whether the ending he wants can still be found inside the cage. Or whether, for the first time in his career, that chapter has already been written.